Hello. So this week we're going to be starting the story Everyday Use by Alice Walker. And this is the story that you're going to be working with for your literary analysis. So we're going to be spending quite a few weeks with this story. We're going to be looking at some other works that you're going to synthesize with this story. Um, But before we get too deep into really talking about the story per se, I want to start with explaining to you a little bit about the concept of theme. Um, so you'll notice here in this first slide, we've got a picture of a Mexican restaurant, and it's decorated according to a theme. It's decorated according to that unified concept that we talk about when we refer to theme. In this case, what are they trying to do? They're trying to immerse you in the feel of being in old Mexico. That's usually what most restaurants strive to do that are Mexican restaurants. Now, if they're Chinese, their goal is to try to immerse you into feeling like you are in China. If it's an Italian restaurant, they might be trying to immerse you in feeling like you're in Italy, whatever the case may be. But you're going to notice that unified concept. And that's essentially what we're getting here. But how does that apply to stories? All right, let's see if it's going to let me advance here. So in stories, poems, films, songs, and even TV shows, theme is really, it's still the unified concept, but it's the unified concept of the story. What is the story about? Now, we talked about that last week when we were talking about summary, and this is where it might get a little bit tricky because sometimes when you say, okay, what's the work about, you will start to summarize. But in this case, when we say, what is the work about, we're saying, what is that bigger unified truth that the work is trying to convey to us? Literary fiction, especially, is concerned with the human condition. It's giving us some slice of truth about what it means to be human, what it means to be us. So when I say what is the work about in terms of theme, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that unified truth. So I do think an easy way to think about theme is to think of it as the story's framework. So you might have a story, and that story is a sequence of events. It's a sequence of things happening. In the case of everyday use, I'll go ahead and tell you this much before you read it. It's a story where we've got a mother who is a narrator, and the mother is telling the story of what happens when her daughter comes home from college. She's got one daughter still at home with her who was injured in a fire years ago when their house burned down. But their oldest daughter, she's been gone for several years. Now she's come home, and all of a sudden she has a very active interest in everything in their home, all of the things that were passed down from their grandparents, for example, things that she had no interest in before. And all of a sudden, because she has gone off to college and she has sort of connected with what they called at the time her Africanism, and she's taken this keen interest in heritage all of a sudden, but with very, very little actual understanding of what heritage means. So heritage, in a sense, is one of those frameworks of the story. And there are several here. But, again, we're looking for, if we had to frame this story, what is that one word concept that we might come up with? And again, heritage works very well in essence. I want to talk to you a little bit about the importance of setting in everyday use. So at the time that this story takes place, it was during the rise of the Black Power movement in the late 60s and early 70s. So just some bullet points here about the Black Power movement, what that consisted of. Black Power is a term that emphasizes racial pride and the desire for African Americans to achieve equality. But, you might say, okay, the goals are similar to the civil rights movement, but Black Power essentially was a little bit more radical in its approach, a little bit more militant, whereas Dr. King had preached nonviolent resistance, the Black Power movement was a little bit more radicalized in that regard. The term was popularized by Stokely Carmichael during the Civil Rights Movement. Many SNCC Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee members were becoming critical of leaders that articulated nonviolent responses to racism. And part of the, I guess we could say a byproduct, rather, of the rise of the Black Power movement and Africanism was this desire to return to African roots. So these are some of the themes of everyday use. What I want you to be thinking about as you're reading the story is how each of these in turn play out. So again, if you get lost, come back to this video, come back to this PowerPoint, come back to this slide here. Family. What is the story telling us about family, especially during this time period? Heritage. What we value and how we value it. Respect for elders and our parents, because that is a crucial theme of the story. The generational divide. And this is something that Alice Walker is really exploring in that story, because during the Black Power movement, there was a huge generation gap between these sometimes very idealistic young people who were embracing these new ideas versus their parents and grandparents who had grown up in a different generation, and who had learned pretty much, the way that you survive is you survive. Okay, you do what you have to do to stay alive. And for a lot of them, that had been a generation bred of silence and endurance. You don't make waves, you don't make trouble. You don't look white people in the eye. That was a theme that comes up over and over in the story. Mother says that, the mother who's narrating the story, she says several times she could never look a white man in the eye. She's very proud of the fact that her daughter can, and her daughter doesn't have that fear bred into her. But at the same time, the mother has a hard time kind of wrapping her hands around the new ideology, right? Because she's never had a voice. She's never had education. She tells us her school was burned down. She's never really had a voice or a say in anything in her whole life. And she's just not sure how to go about things in this new environment. It did create a lot of tension sometimes among families, especially between children and parents, right? Because in many cases, the children, and this is something that plays out in Walker's story, the children were rejecting the very values that their parents had tried to instill in them. In some cases, even rejecting their given names, right? Taking on a new identity, taking on an African name instead of the name that their mother or grandmother or whoever had given to them. And of course, for the parents, it was hurtful because they looked at that as a rejection of who they were. And that's what we see play out in this story. You know, we've got the argument over the quilts and we've got the argument over these material things, but those things are just representative of what's really going on here, which is that generational conflict. Has some glitches there. But here are a couple of illustrations to, I hope, really hit home that point about this generational conflict. So the way that the daughter is described, Dee, she would be very much like the young woman that you see on the left here. You know, and this is very typically what a lot of young African American women look like or aspire to look like in the early 70s when this story is taking place. Notice the afro, okay? That's a political statement. You know, what was the afro all about? It was all about reclaiming racial pride and identity. You know, wearing natural hair, for example. Wearing very bold and loud clothing that advertised this is who we are. Versus if you look at, you know, typically someone like that image on the right there, which would be the way the mother describes herself. She might be a little huskier than this lady here. But that very typically that's the generation that this new generation was rebelling against. And this is what the mother represents here. All right, I am going to close out this video so that I don't run out of time, and I'm going to pick up the discussion in part 2 of this. All right, so just hang tight. I will see you next video. Bye-bye.